Bloodstones by Martin Wallace. The designer of this #1 game on BGG now has his own company called Wallace Designs. And to kick it off, he made this war game in this high fantasy land with dragons, undead, trolls, and then there's not just one map, but there's 6 maps to play. In Bloodstones, you enter the world of Foul, where there's 6 factions fighting for dominance. You play by using tiles from your bag, which are units and cards at the same time. You spawn your faction's units, spread your villages across the map, and fight battles against your fantastical enemies. By the way, you can play this at any player count between 1 to 6, and we're going to talk about every single player count. We played this a bunch of times though, with 4 players being the most amount. If you play 4 players, that is about 2.5 hours on average. Last thing to know before jumping in, you can only get Bloodstones as of right now if you back the Gamefound campaign. There's only 1 tier to buy, which is $100. Oh, by the way, this review is brought to you by Ascension.gg. This is a private free-to-play World of Warcraft server so you can play for the Horde. It revolves around being classless, where you can pick your own unique hero by combining abilities from all classes. I gave it a quick run and it was a fun mix of nostalgia with added quality of life stuff. Like, the game feels much faster with the draft builds, where you can just learn preset ability trees to combo together. I used the Wind Berserker in the starting area and it was so fast, and you can go even faster with the leveling draft builds. The new season also has tons of new modes, including the wildcard mode. When we tried it out, it was super busy. It's where you get random abilities as you level, and you can roll a loadout right when you start, and you can re-roll it. Once you've rolled your initial build, you can refine it by playing through the endgame and prestiging. That is basically infinite replayability. So click the link in the description below to play Ascension WoW Destiny's Dawn for the new season. Back to the review. How to play. Goal is to get as many points as possible. You do this in one of 3 ways. 1. Get a bunch of villages out and keep them out. Number 2. Win fights. Number 3. Capture enemy villages. To do this, you'll have a hand of 6 tiles to use every turn. Usually each tile is a unit. Their stats and abilities are all explained by your player board. A common unit would be a swordsman who always gives 1 strength in battle, or a siege engine that is worth 2 strength if attacking a citadel, aka home base. On a turn, you can discard as many tiles as you want from hand to do any combination of the following. 1. Use the pips printed on the right of the tile to give any of your units movement. If moving on the easy planes, it costs 1 pip for 1 unit to move in. If you move 2 units into that, well, that would be both pips spent. Number 2 use, actually spawn that unit wherever you have a village or a citadel. Just keep in mind that some units might make you discard others as a cost to spawn them. And before your turn ends, if you're on the same space as your enemy, like here if we just moved into him, we have to attack. If they don't withdraw, which is something we'll explain later, you fight. Both players will take out one of these combat bags. They both have the same tiles, and you both secretly take out tiles. You normally take out 3, but if you have a bigger army, you take 4 out, and then you keep the highest 3. To win, you want the highest number, and you can replace a tile with one in your hand. Using the right pips as a new value, attacker must do this first. Both players reveal, and you add these values to your unit stats, which usually give bonuses under certain conditions. Like cavalry don't do jack if they're not free to prance around in the open plains. Whoever wins gets VP equal to the number of units they defeated. If you kill someone's home base, they're not out of the game, but you do take that citadel token, it's worth 5 points endgame. For the loser, one of the units dies, then the rest retreats into a friendly or empty area. Once your turn is up, you can discard a tile to build villages next to any of your units, as long as you can draw a line back to one of your villages. Finally, draw back up to 6 tiles, that's your turn. Oh, you might have been wondering how to get rid of your opponent's villages. So if you start your turn with units on top of opponent's villages, and the opponent is not there, you can discard 1 tile to capture villages equal to that pip number. Anyways, seeing how you're drawing tiles from your bag at the end of turns, the moment that bag is empty, it's regrouping time. You get points equal to the amount of villages you have out. The moment every player does this regrouping twice, the game immediately ends. You get bonus points for each village you have captured, hey, getting rewarded for violence. That's a basic summary of Bloodstones. You're spawning villages, making sure they're reasonably protected, attacking your opponent's villages, capturing those. You get rewards for beating your opponents in fights, and then your turn is spending as many of the 6 tiles in front of you as you want. Once you spend all those, you draw back up to 6. That's a turn. Pros! Component pros time, and you got a ton of these bags, and they all feel nice. They also happen to be embroidered, which gets you more texture when you're holding them. Oh, and then the maps, you get 6 of these, by the way. That's crazy. These are allegedly machine washable, but we're not gonna test that though. If you look at each map, there's some cool little details, like a nice little house or an octopus hanging out in the lake. They don't detract from visual clarity at all and only add to the feeling of a real world. And for the booklets, the promised linen blend is nice. It's not just hoity-toity talk. It actually does feel nicer to flip through. Lastly, for component pros, this does does come with a little bag. I mean, it's like your standard thin gym bag you might get as free swag from a college seminar. But hey, it does do the job if you ever want to not take the box that has map art printed inside and bring the components with you easily. And as you might have noticed, there's a ton of different art for the game for the factions. It's convenient that the core units look relatively similar, like swordsmen, just with different details, so you can tell what they are at a glance. They weren't afraid to vary the other those with different ships, different castles, different citadels, different villages. Man, I could just keep going on. As you get started, Bloodstones is extremely easy to get going, especially for its time length and scope of gameplay. All you do is give everyone 2 bags. Here you go. Then you unfold the map you're playing on. And then that's basically it. You can just start playing. Heck, if you put this smaller bag inside the bigger bag, because they do fit together, you could just give everyone 1 bag. The rulebook is generally smooth to get you started on the game, with nice TLDR areas to let you hop right in. There's some nice strategy tips that are very legit for beginners, like what are good starting factions, how to place armies, and how to use ships. And there's a player aid at the back. Gameplay pros time, and the first pro here is the crunchy, yet elegant in terms of components, combat system that the entire game revolves around. If we rewind to the how to play, notice how fighting is influenced by 3 things. The quantity of units, having more is better. Then there's the actual strength of the units, that is if they're actually providing strength in a fight. Then finally you have the ability to replace a tile with something from your hand. Whoa, okay, so that means that when it's on your turn, you have to be constantly looking at armies on the map and seeing how strong they are in their position. Remember from the how to play that horses only have combat value in plains. But there's also units that give combat value when attacking or defending, but with this one now you win ties when defending. There are skirmishers that only get value in forest, castles that give 3 value but can't move and are a perfect target for siege engines. Oh, also if you're defending a castle, you can't retreat before combat. Retreating, aka withdrawing. We have to talk about the nuance in this. So actually, you can always withdraw during combat, except if your opponent has more cavalry than you. This makes cavalry very impactful to position, and remember, they only give strength on plains. Here's an example of this trickery. You move into attack with cavalry and some cheap goblin units. That's a massive fight. You win that. They can't run away because you don't have cavalry. Then on your opponent's turn, they counterattack with the remains of the defeated army, and your goblins contribute no bonus when defending, so your army is just not as strong anymore. So maybe if you decided to attack like that previously, you box in your opponent. They can't retreat anywhere, so then they all die. There's terrain that makes the analysis of fronts more complicated. Like hills are harder to walk into and so make incredible bases, and deserts cannot become bases for villages and kills units that end there, but someone can spend like crazy to move their army through it. Moving through it is actually cheaper than walking through hills. Also, getting points for winning combat can massively swing games because it's 1 point per unit defeated. This provides some discouragement against turtling and deathballing because stacking your army in one place is generally high risk, low reward. If you win a fight against a smaller force, you got 1, maybe 2 VP for moving your entire army by discarding a crazy amount to move each unit individually. But if you lost, well, then your opponent just got 5 to 10 points off of a single combat in a game where end scores are 55 plus. Because unit movement is paid for individually and how incentives for fighting are, moving on your turn becomes an incredibly nuanced thing. You have to decide how to stack each specific unit, where to stack them, or just move them individually to harass your opponent. It's here we have to point out that ships give you bonkers movement potential, because they're actually just bridges for your units, so you can move through them as if that land is now adjacent. So if you have multiple ships, you can literally move across the map as a single movement. Oh, the places you'll go. This also encourages a different type of fighting over control of the sea if you want to, and if you maneuver correctly, you can even landlock enemy armies. As for when units actually smash into each other, there's some slight randomness through drawing tiles out of a bag, but it's actually very commendably handled. Each bag has 8 tiles, which are all just pairs of 2 through 5. So 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5. And then you increase your odds of winning by just having more units than your opponent because you get to see 1 more tile than them. You draw 4 instead of 3, which feels great and makes sense thematically. Then even more, when you see the 3 tiles, you can replace one of them with something from your hand. This rewards you for planning well with your hand. If we look at the extremes with your own 5 pip factored in, because that's the best thing you can commit, the worst you can get from 3 tiles is a 10, which is definitely above the expected average for not replacing, so not bad. Essentially, the range of outcomes is mitigated by your play well, and we agree with the rulebook that if you're +2 over your opponent, you're generally gonna win fights. The last thing about combat pros is that the loose turn structure rewards you for setting up well, where you can attack as many times during your turn, as long as you can pay for it. So you can have a big turn where you move to attack someone, see how they retreat, and if they retreat in a certain way, you can keep attacking them again, and as long as you can pay for it, you can attack them, which rewards you for setting up well too. The next gameplay pro is a hand management, where it really matters and is crunchy and nuanced, which again is kind of like a combat pro because discarding from hand boosts your combat and is units for combat, so yeah. But going deeper into this, almost all tiles are units. So you have to weigh the trade-off between playing it as a unit, which can be really expensive, or using it to move. And you can discard multiple things, which opens up a huge capacity for movement. Or you can just save it to discard at the end of your turn to build villages. There's also some clever reverse bag building going on from your hand management. Wait, what? Reverse bag building? Yeah, so contrary to games like this, where you're building up a bag of things, here you're taking tiles out of it as you spawn more units on the board. If they're on the board, when you regroup, that is replenish your bag, they're not going to be in your bag anymore. So maybe you play all these really weak tiles early to get them out of your bag and give you a smaller bag. And remember that building your bag dictates your final regroup. And if you're the last player to do this, you have the final turn. So if you have a bigger bag that is depleted more slowly, you'll have a bigger chance of going last, but doing that means the map will likely have less of your units and villages because you're playing slowly. It's a type of endgame build you can experiment with. Now we can finally get into it, the 6 different factions you can play, the asymmetry pros. Now before we jump the gun, we want to point out that 3 of them are a little more similar to one another. They're more of the normal type, so let's start with these. The hill folk have the widest mix of units in the game, can go on mountains, which no other unit can, and they have Shrek. I mean, this hill troll. I like to call him Shrek though, because he gets people out of his swamp by letting him always draw 4 combat tiles when fighting. He's always 2 power no matter what. Oh, you got 2 Shrek too. The horse lords have a bit more cavalry units and have an extra leader unit, which is really nice because those are units that when they move, they take someone else for free with them. So much value. What's the most lordly is that the horse lords have 7 tiles in hand instead of 6. So they have a lot more firepower on every turn, and we'll get back to this later. If you like dragons, pick the dragon riders who have 2 dragons, a unit that can fly over terrain, including water, and is worth 4 power. Remember how strong Shrek was? This dragon is double that power. It just dies after attacking, but who cares? It's mega strong, or just use it for defense. Now it's time for the way more asymmetrical factions. Cosplay as Pirates of the Caribbean and do a pirate chanty with the Corsairs, who are all about playing next to the water. It's the pirate way to run away whenever you get attacked next to your ships. Cause hop on those boats, mateys, and we'll fight again another day. If you want to ramp, you go for the Necromancers, who are able to spawn undead units, who move for free every round. They're not living, so they don't care about deserts. Just kill things with your Necromancer and you get undead equal to the amount of things you killed. So if you're able to surround your enemy, that leads to tons of undead. The craziest faction we had to save for last is the Chaos Horde, who don't have villages. They don't have a citadel either. Instead, they can spawn anywhere they have units. So yep, that means you can move troops, then immediately spawn on top of them. Oh, they also totally break the game open because they capture villages during the middle of their turn as opposed to the beginning of their turn. And they can do it when someone else is there, hee 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 hee. Since they can't score via regrouping, cause no villages, the captured villages are worth double, and they start at 10 VP. If they ever get knocked off the map, no biggie, they can spawn anywhere. Haha, yeah, emerge from the desert sands. So that's a glance at each faction, and as we back up, they all have different quantities of units, and then of course there's certain special units for some factions. Bag numbers are just tweaked. Chaos Horde has 20 units that only benefit off of attacking, Corsairs only have 1 siege engine, Hillfolk has 7 castles instead of 5, and that castle is cheaper, the list goes on and on. There's also cool progression in Bloodstones. The fact that you want to place tons of villages to get points, and so you will be fighting over villages. And as there's more turns, there's usually bigger armies, so more climactic fights with more VP payouts. Endgame, as in the last or second to last turn, will have a mad scramble to also sit on lots of enemy villages. Because we didn't explain this yet, but at the end of the game, you just take whatever villages your units are on. So that's way more points. This makes the endgame more tense as you want to anticipate which of your villages your opponents will move into and defend those. Or maybe you just counterattack them to see if taking their stuff is more VP for you. Oh yeah, since everything moves individually, the more units you have across the board, the more the decision space just increases exponentially for positioning. And if you have ships, my goodness, oh, the places you'll go. Speaking of the progression, Bloodstones also tends to run quite true to time of 2.5 hours for the 4-player mark. 3 players can easily be done between 1.5 to 2 hours once you're familiar. The game will really never drag in turns because even if you slow play, you can't prevent yourself from bagging out entirely if you want to have a shot at winning. Whew, okay, now it's time for replayability, and there is a lot in this box. I mean, 6 factions, right? 6 factions. Your opening spawn really matters, where you have a hand of 9 tiles to choose from to place your units, and where you put your citadel or home base really matters, and you can choose almost anywhere on the map. How close you are to which opponent, which terrain is around you, and what water is around you is extremely key. And remember, there are 6 different maps. Yeah, so Remains of the Past is a little bit more normal with some big hills in the middle. Lady of the Lake is a huge lake in the middle with one small island you can fight over. Swan Dance is pretty vanilla. In Tyrant's Lament, you have a lot of forest on the top and desert on the bottom. Will the desert on the bottom be a dead zone, or will someone try to make a big push to cross it? There's Sorcerer's Crucible, which is a huge island with water surrounding it. Ships can give you insane movement in this map. Like Corsairs will have a field day since they benefit a lot off of boats. Then this peninsula one has only water on the bottom and forest on the top. These maps have even more use in the solo mode, where there's a mini campaign for each faction, consisting of 3 scenarios. So in total, you have 18 scenarios. We've only tested one, but it does look like they scale up in difficulty, which is a great way to get used to factions. The one I tried with Necromancers had straightforward setup and provides some cool time constraints to balance out the bad guys acting a lot differently than humans. The last gameplay pro is how the theme of Bloodstones, that is, this world of foul, meets the gameplay very well, and let's go back to the factions. They all make sense. Corsairs have a yo-ho-ho pirate's life hanging out by the sea near their ships, running away via jumping on their ships. The dragon is incredible at flying over the map and just burning down citadels. It is like a nuke in this game and can act like a deterrent to others getting on your bad side, because you got a dragon. And they also can't run away from it. Do I say it's kind of like Game of Thrones burning down troops? The Chaos Horde is literally chaos. They just move wherever they want. They seek to burn everything to the ground with a ton of units that spawn for free. Onto units specifically, it makes sense why horses are only good in the plains and how you can't run away from horses if they have more than you. Skirmishers camping in the trees to get combat is straight up out of Robin Hood. The undead for the necromancers just shamble through the mountains because they don't get tired. And the hill folk are the only others that can move into these mountains. Cons. Cons time. Now let's talk about these bags because they're everywhere and they certainly could have been made better. We know we're not alone in the fact that tassels easily break off, kind of sucky when they all fall off and then the string can come out of the bag. But our bigger concern is that they're actually too small for a game where you're refilling your bag at least twice, meaning you should be able to stick in your hands and shuffle with a lot of tiles inside. For the combat bag with 8 tiles, this is fine. But once you get to 20 plus, it's a bit tricky. The next component con is 2 things combined, and I'll just show you. This is 2 armies fighting each other. Oh my gosh. Units are spilling out of the space and going to others. That's confusing. It's especially bad on Tyrant's Lament. And oh my goodness, some of the spaces can barely even hold 1 tile. So we were constantly getting confused where units actually were. This isn't as bad in maps with bigger areas like Lady of the Lake, but you will end up with some tile madness if you have any area where multiple units are attacking each other. Like, look at a generic game opening. Citadel plus units? Oh man, that place is already spilling out. So yeah, these maps are just too small for what these tiles are. And I'd imagine you can't make these any smaller, so you gotta make the map bigger. So then you have to constantly stack units on top of each other. But the problem is that they don't stack perfectly because they're not exactly all flat.
I'm gonna do this. 7. Yeah, okay, what's that? Yeah. 8v8. All right.
We suspect they were supposed to be flat by looking at the campaign page, so yeah, this is super irritating. In our struggles of keeping track of all the important unit counts, we've had many fall over and just have to be restacked. And in all the chaos, 2 villages have been mistaken for a unit before too, if you look at it from some angles. Maybe these should have had a more textured border. Besides making the board bigger and getting cleaner stacking, we would suggest army markers like War of the Ring, where if your army is just too insanely big, put down a marker that reflects your giant army that you put somewhere else off on the map. Lastly, for the map, the rivers are just too confusing for being pure decoration. Like, they are so prominent on the board that it would make sense why they block off movement, but they don't. If you're gonna put rivers everywhere, just make them less exaggerated or add bridges like Game of Thrones 2nd edition. Back to the tiles, they actually don't stand up that well. Remember, they're not all perfectly flat. So you can do this spread I've been showing and have them sometimes fall over, or just use your own card holders, which you repurpose into tile holders. But remember, these are tiles, so your mileage may vary depending on your card holder shape. We got another component con with this combat bag, where it's actually a weird choice to not have the tiles double-sided and not provide a combat screen. What? You may say, this isn't that big of a deal. It's not that hard to keep them secret, right? Well, when you're actually reaching in the bag, you don't know what face the tiles will be. So we've had instances of accidentally flashing your opponent the all-important combat strength before you choose to replace. Even when you do manage to keep it secret, it's just not conveniently done as you reach inside the bag, and half of the time the tiles are face down, so you have to turn them over. It's adding more friction to combat than there should be, and you fight a lot in this game. So yeah, make this player aid a combat screen to hide your tiles, then make the tiles double-sided, and this would all help a lot because you're fighting a lot in this game. The player aid also has some issues. First, they're way too wordy with units and being really redundant, and there's plenty of hanging words that make it even harder to read and waste space. Like, look at this dragon. Not fun to read as a newcomer. The entire first sentence could just say, on a successful attack, discard this tile. And I know you can make it cleaner, Martin Wallace, because in your rulebook, you have this exact wording. Player aids are also missing the crucial combat mechanic about cavalry withdrawal, where if you have more cav when attacking your opponent, they can't withdraw. This has bamboozled many a newcomer. Then there's some more specific errors, like Corsairs say that their opponents can't retreat if adjacent to ships, so you can use this ability for naval combat, right? Nope, in the rulebook it says this is only land combat. Then the Necromancer's board has a typo of the shield cost. Man, I'm surprised how this actually got through. Now we're going into rulebook cons, and while I don't own this game, I was able to read this after learning the game, and one problem stood out to me like a sore thumb. This has to do with capturing villages, where it doesn't clarify if you can capture the village if the opponent has units there. This usually won't matter because you have to fight before ending turns, and you can only capture at the beginning of turns, except for the Chaos Horde, who can move and capture on the same turn. So this matters all the time for Chaos Horde. I had to go down a BGG thread to confirm my beliefs that it doesn't have to be empty. Gameplay cons time, and first we're going to talk about the faction balance, because there's a couple of these that caught our eye. The Lordly Horse Lords are just too strong. Not only do they have an extra leader, one of the best generic units in the game, but they also have 7 tiles in hand. We kid you not that the extra tile over everyone makes a world of difference. You see more tiles, so you have more options, and you will win fights more often because you have more resources. Pile this action efficiency onto them having a ton of cavalry, and it's so good to just fight on your turns, pretty much always winning fights as you run down helpless infantry. We have to bring up the dragon from the Dragon Riders, which is a unit that feels out of place in Bloodstones. See, Bloodstones is a game of fighting and winning by careful margins, where managing your bag in hand better is the idea. But for the dragon, because of its wild strength, and how the Dragon Riders don't really have anything else going for them, if you draw them both at the end of your first bag, well, too bad, you got them both late. And you might not even be able to spend them in time to shuffle it back for your next bag. So yeah, you just can't use your dragon as much. The Horse Lord's action efficiency and Dragon Riders Dragons makes it more possible for these factions to get an early lead, and keep it. And if you're the Horse Lords, well, you can just keep snowballing. Remember how we praised that Bloodstones discourages deathballing in pros? Well, you can definitely deathball with these two factions. For the Horse Lords, 2 leaders and 2 cavalry is a nice core of a death ball. And then if you have a dragon, 1 lizard attacker, and 1 siege engine, that's a pretty good attacking force against the Citadel. Chaos Horde is also good at snowballing because they have access to 10 cavalry as opposed to most players 4 to 5, and can spawn where they move. So why is deathballing so bad? Well, it makes this game a dick-swinging contest of whoever has the biggest army, and removes the cooler positioning plays. You should be defending many villages as you carefully position and move across the map, not just smashing 2 big things against one another. These next faction concerns aren't as bad. Like the Corsairs who like to run away and do surprise attacks are countered by the Chaos and Dragon Riders. Chaos counter them because they have 10 horses, which means they can more frequently run away when the pirates want to attack them. And they can take their villages without a fight, which goes against the Corsair gameplay of leaving villages open as bait and then swooping in from the sea. For the dragons, well, no unit can ever run away from a dragon. So if there's a crucial Corsair fight, the dragon just comes in, nukes their Corsair army when they want to be constantly running away. Whoop-de-doo. The last faction to utilize in cons is the Hill Folk, who really want to be utilizing their ability to go into mountains. And there's 0 mountains on Lady of the Lake, so don't play them there. This other map, Remains of the Past, has only 1 good location area for their citadel to go. Again, we're really bent up about the imbalance because this is a tight war game where combat is won on the margins. Balance is more important here than, say, TI4, another area control, which has so much negotiation where your group can self-balance. So make sure you don't have certain matchups or newcomers playing factions on certain maps, and if you're really competitive about it, you can just institute a draft system to draft starting locations and factions. Let's go into a new gameplay cons direction with player count where the Bloodstone systems is really strained at the 3 and 4 player count. There tends to be very distinct fronts constructed where you stand your armies on the borders and then isolate hard by building villages behind you. This works in 2 players, but in 3 to 4, if someone's away from everyone else, their villages are just going to be harder to get to. They don't get punished because whoever moves over to them just gets attacked by their neighbor. What usually ends up in 3 to 4 players is that someone will end up trying to deathball into another player's citadel to cinch the game. Or you're taking a bunch of random inconsequential fights to eke out an advantage. If the Mexican standoff is broken by someone winning an early game fight, it's really hard to come back in 3 players. And then the third party is in a weird situation where they can attack the loser to just get more easy points, or fight an uphill battle against the winner. If this situation happens at 4 players, it's very kingmaking, where the person who gets utterly beat on is still out of the game, but there's generally 2 people in contention of winnings, and so whoever he attacks will just not win the game. Now we want to clarify, kingmaking is always going to happen in area controls to some degree. It's just that the poison is in the dosage. If kingmaking happens on the last turn, that's totally fine, because you played the game. You went through the journey to get to the final turn. But if kingmaking happens on the second turn, that's a problem. It's kind of like how cooperative games handle the issue of quarterbacking. Anyways, back to kingmaking, it's why a lot of modern area controls have ways to scale points up. That is, the longer the game goes, the better the payouts get. Blood Rage and Rising Sun have different ages to get more points as the game progresses, and TI4 has stronger objectives. In 3 to 4 player Bloodstones, you can't really do the traditional area control thing of, hey, let's just make a permanent alliance with someone else to solve this leader issue. This is because you're just way too incentivized to attack your neighbors. Winning easy fights is good points. It's not surprising for someone to be effectively eliminated in the second or third turn. Contrast this to, say, Root, where the asymmetrical movement rules do wonders for facilitating table talk. Or in TI4, where there's wormholes all across the map with movement upgrades, so everything is a front at some point, and there's also fleet limits to deter snowballing. So wait a second, why doesn't this Mexican standoff issue happen in other player accounts? Well, 2-player is a head-to-head issue, so there's just one massive front. Single player is a campaign, and with 5 to 6 players, there's just way more borders. I mean, look at this. More people can just attack everyone else. Now the game hinges much more on diplomacy, and there's more room to make cool plays. You literally cannot cover everything, and if you do deathball, you leave way too much open for 3 to 4 other players. It's where the tight nature of the game works for careful trade-offs, and you maximize around stuff constantly happening. There is a saving grace for 4 players where you can play with the Chaos Horde, because if it wasn't clear from their description, they actually just blow the game wide open. They're like a freaking plague that keeps reappearing to gobble up villages on their turn. So people have to position everything, especially villages, more deliberately. But if you can, play with higher player counts. That's it for gameplay cons. We have one more con, that is the time length. They're only listing 1 time length on the Gamefound. In 1 to 3 players, you probably get shorter than 2.5 hours, but in 5 to 6 players, it's definitely way longer than 2.5 hours. Our game was 4.5 hours at 6 players. It's just so long because the game state is just way more inherently complicated with more players. And so there's just more of an issue with moving anything. It's hard to plan ahead much because of the sheer possibilities for movement. What's really shooting up the length is the end, where you have a lot of fights, where 6 players have way more targets to attack. And so you have to grab those combat bags and fight away. Big fight versus small fight takes about the same amount of time, and the combat bags aren't the fastest system. I'm really surprised they didn't just say 45 minutes per player and called it a day. Scoring! Now it's time for a recommender score on Bloodstones, where we try to critically evaluate the aforementioned pros and cons with the caveat of whether or not this is even a good idea in the first place. And this is a tight war game with a fantasy theme where you're playing tiles from your bag, which you build over time. And so this is gonna get a recommender score of 6 out of 10. Above average. We have to go back to the tiles on the board. And oh my gosh, is this such a janky system for how you're supposed to be constantly analyzing armies and the terrain they're on. Like, was this game not tested in person? I guess maybe it was from seeing these photos. As for the gameplay, the more I played Bloodstones, even with all the asymmetry and all the content in the game, Bloodstones feels like a very old school game. It feels like an older styled game. And by reading the designer diaries, this idea came to Wallace in 2010, but it feels even older than that. The teach is fairly simple for the deaf, but the game front loads a ton of information with all the units to learn, with decent asymmetry to boot. And gameplay is really punishing, where winners are hugely rewarded with points, you're incentivized to beat up losers when they're down, and point payouts don't scale up. The fact that you can spawn your citadel anywhere, which gives you agency and replayability, also means that you can get your teeth wildly bashed in as a noob and you spawn in a weird place. Every choice super matters, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's easy to feed someone accidentally and give them a ton of points through a pivotal fight. Heck, this reminds us of Tigris and Euphrates, another old school game that came out in 1997, so 27 years ago, where you're open to kind of just place wherever, and a noob could foolishly wage a war and just feed the winner of that war a bunch of points in a certain color they really needed. And so the game is thrown for the others. The core of Bloodstones is very simple. With nothing to do on your opponent's turns, there's not really anything to incentivize table talk because diplomacy is pretty minimal, with asymmetry not being crazy nuanced. There's not really any phases or ages, so the responsibility to win is to track well from the get-go. As you squeeze from your hand, this game is just not forgiving like more newer designs. There's also people calling this a War Euro or a War Euro because of how village spawning works, where, oh, shouldn't I just spawn as many as I can to scale up in that way? But I suspect they feel this way because of how 4P just doesn't work that well for the combat incentives without the Chaos Horde in the mix. Also, perfect village placement only gets you 40 points, and we see winners usually get at least 55 plus. So yeah, you do need to be winning meaningful fights, and this leans way more war game than Euro. Bloodstones is lifted up from the 5 out of 10 score because of how much sheer content that is, and if you're okay with the tile jank, there's a lot of tight wargaming value to be had here. Even though the 2-player only gives you access to 4 of the factions because you can't play with Chaos Horde or the Corsairs, you still got 6 maps to use. Then just get a bunch of people together to do an all-out brawl at 5 to 6 players and unleash chaos into the world. If you really do want to play at 4, remember Chaos Horde is your friend, but man, everyone hates them as they burn the world. And then solo has many hours of game. The fact that solo is such a big selling point nowadays had us think, what if there wasn't a solo mode though? What if you took these old school mechanics and had them not on a contemporary deluge of maps, and maybe just had very tightly designed 1 or 2 maps? If 1 or 2 maps were really defined, like they had more points of interest to fight over, like maybe giving payouts for holding certain areas in a King of the Hill aspect, would that not work better for this tight wargaming angle? But yeah, we got big content instead, and you can experiment with how you may in multiplayer. One Sherlock moment from reading Wallace's design diaries, he says that he wanted to create Bloodstones because he saw an FFG production in 2010 that had tons of components. And I can suspect by the timing that the game is probably chaos in the old world. And so Bloodstones is his self-proclaimed anti-FFG that also has a strong theme and deep gameplay without so many components. And by reading the rest, I also suspect that the dragon was something he really wanted to have, and with theme being his grounding factor behind the design. And so maybe the game should have done more to accommodate the dragon's swinginess. Is Martin Wallace actually achieving what he set out to do in the first place, to have a thematic playground with minimal components where a dragon works? Anyways, this is all just reading deeper into his diaries and hypothesizing. I haven't talked to Wallace myself. And so now our personal scores can inform you more about our enjoyment of this.
My personal score for Bloodstones is going to be a 5 out of 10. An average time. This game, while pretty tight mechanically, just feels really dry to me. I'm a sucker for pretty art and minis, which Bloodstone does not hit for me at all. The domino-like tiles with simple art are not evocative for me, nor is the theme since it's just basic fantasy. Plus, I really do not like the physical act of using the tiles since they don't stack well, don't hold together well like a hand of cards, and they tend to block information on the map really easily. So that's probably more on the map having really small areas in combination with there being a lot of different unit types. Combine that with how the gameplay doesn't have any mechanics built in for diplomacy, nor any particularly wacky effects, and that makes it so that I'm bored a good chunk of the time because it kind of just feels like I'm just counting things the whole time. For my personal taste, there desperately needs to be more going on, like a progression system, special locations on the map to fight over, absurdly unique abilities to wrap your head around. You know, basically anything with Cole Worley's name on it. And while that non-stop counting experience is pretty akin to a lot of solitaire Euros, at least this is an area control, so yeah, there's obviously tons of player interaction going on, which is what's stopping this from dipping into the negative side of the scoring spectrum. That player interaction is pretty basic though. We're basically just comparing numbers instead of also yelling about auxiliary hilarity like extra abilities thrown into the mix. It doesn't help either that when playing at 4 players, the conflict felt very one-dimensional because you usually just fight your neighbor since it's way too expensive to haul ass to the other side of the board, so you're better off just taking closer fights to be efficient with your moves. I will mention though that I've played 3 games at 4-player and 1 at 6-player, with that 6-player game feeling significantly better than the rest. I was even tempted to put the score lower until we played the 6-player game, at which point I'm like, Not bad. Problem is, if we have 6 players in like 4 to 5 hours, there's so many other games I'd rather be playing, like Sidereal Confluence, Human Punishment at the Beginning, Twilight Imperium, again with anything co-whirly, and I know some of those aren't area control, so it's a weird comparison, but having 6 people feels more like a special occasion, so I'm not really thinking about particular genres, but rather what kind of huge player count experience we all want right now. Oh yeah, it also doesn't help that there's only 6 factions, so you always see them all 6p. Would really help my enjoyment if there were more of them, or if they were made even more asymmetric, because it'd be sick if all of them were as different as the Corsairs or the Chaos Horde, which is basically just a retrain of my earlier complaint about how there's not enough going on specialty-wise. In short, Bloodstones is an area control that doesn't have anything I'm attached to besides the fact that it's an area control, which is what's preventing it from being a bad time. So that basically just leaves it being super mid for my enjoyment levels. I like rambunctiousness in my game nights, and tight, dry games just ain't delivering that.
My personal score for Bloodstones, of which I played every single faction, is going to be a 4 out of 10, a below average time. Now, my first exposure to this was playing it on TTS with a friendly patron, so 1v1, and I was immediately impressed. I liked the tight gameplay, using tiles for multiple things, and how the combat system was done. And I was like, oh man, this could be my asymmetrical war game that fits with any player count on about under 2 hours. As a card game lover myself, I was fascinated how much hand management was into a meaty war game. Positioning around fronts felt natural with the terrain to account for, necromancer skeletons were fun to use, and I liked the high fantasy theme. Fast forward to about 2 months ago, and my friend said, hey, I got this game by Martin Wallace called Bloodstones, and look at all these maps we can play with, and now there's a Chaos Horde faction. So we played it, and it was fun. I liked seeing the thing come to life, and even at 3 players, it was pretty cool. But then, the more I played Bloodstones, the more I began to realize, oh, this isn't really for me, and there's a lot of concerns, so let's go. The first aspect is how there's just not enough progression systems for how long the game is. When the game was novel, that's totally fine, but when I played it for the 3rd time, I began to feel quite skittish about, say, 1.5 bags into the game. It just feels repetitive in drawing tiles that are samey. I'm always spawning units, with no big upgrades or named areas to control to look forward to. Like, I can't think of another game that runs 2.5 hours with 4 players that doesn't have at least some type of meaningful individual progression. I mean, sure, I guess here you're technically taking away tiles from your bag, but that doesn't feel that satisfying. And then when you play with 6 players for 4.5 hours, holy moly, just give me more things to do. For how long it is, Bloodstones needs more components for me. Like, it's literally all tiles, which I loved as a concept at first, but again, when the game is past an hour, I want more to do with my hands. Cards, chits, miniatures, dials, just give me more variety. That's why they tend to be inserted in big FFG games. While I said I like the theme a lot, Bloodstones actually ends up feeling quite abstract to me quickly because it just feels like tile stacking and moving with just numbers. Yeah, everything just becomes a number because it's a very tight war game. Tiles are usually giving 0 or 1, but at least horses do change up combat a bit. You know what? I've had it with the tile stacking. I have had it. At first I thought it was okay, there's just some stacking going on, and then later on in our games it felt a little bit annoying, and now I've just had it with having to reach over the table and carefully count, especially now that we're all getting good at the game, and so the margins really do matter. Yeah, then moving these big stacks of things into each other is just constant confusion. Unless there's a bigger board, the 1 to 2 player mode is the one I'm more okay with seeing if this is gonna be so tile madness shenanigans. The combat system also has tiles, and that also begins to wear on me. Sure, there's some really tense moments. I do love myself drawing 5s and replacing 5s, and the randomness is handled well. But it's just too time consuming for how much is happening in multiplayer. 2-player, it's okay because you're always fighting. There's way too much downtime when it's not my turn, especially worse than 5 to 6 players. Like, what am I gonna do? Keep counting the tiles during other people's turns? So I just frequently zone out or leave the room when it's not my turn and I know I'm not getting attacked. I'm pulled between wanting to constantly count because Bloodstones is punishing with not wanting to count because of component jank. Bloodstones is the epitome of it's only fun when you win or are winning, because your options just massively increase for winning combat and holding areas, and if you're behind, endgame is especially excruciating as everyone does their fights and moves around. You see them have 60 plus points, you're at high 30s or low 40s, and you go like, well, I had 2 bad regroups. I'm genuinely surprised they just didn't go all the way with the war game aspect and make capturing citadels, that is people's bases, a win condition or part of a win condition. Like if the game just ended when someone did that, I would be way more invested. Reminds me of taking someone's capital in Civ the board game. But yeah, you would have to tweak some more mechanics. Bloodstones currently just culminates into an experience where decisions are perpetually interesting. I mean, I like area controls and it does do that, where it can be a really tense endgame, although a bit dry and repetitive, with the combat and no satisfying progression, and ultimately just not quite worth the time and investment for me. I'm excited by the maps. all the cool movement possibilities, especially when you throw in the ships into the mix. It's just that I really think this idea, this fantasy of Bloodstones is just so much more fun than it actually is. I thought this game would be a 7 out of 10 easily, or even an 8 out of 10 for me, but the more I just played it, the more my score just dropped. And I think I'm beginning to learn that these tight, long war games that you should play at 6 players are just not really quite my jam. It really kind of gave me Dune the board game vibes at the 3rd and 4th hour of 6p. But Dune the board game is a lot more jank and not as tight. Quick discussion on factions. I utterly despise the Corsairs, playing as them and against them. They just feel so stagnant to play with a very dull bag, and to play against them, they obviously just run away, which is annoying. I do quite like Chaos Horde and Necromancer, probably the latter so much because they actually have progression with spawning cool skeletons, which have their own movement phase. And I think playing them first has skewed my first impression so positively. I would be down to play this again at 2 players, especially more over TTS, but with any other player count, I would certainly rather be playing something else. That is Bloodstones, guys. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think of this game, and if there's any other Martin Wallace games we should be looking at. Yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you to our patrons over there in the corner over there. Don't ask where I am. The video footage is nowhere to be found. And then also thank you to our Mad Lads of Cardboard right over here in the corner over there. Yeah, Mad Lads of Cardboard. Anyways, remember to like, comment, subscribe. That's it. See you guys later. Bye-bye.